Hello everyone, and welcome to TVR's webinar, Data Center Revolution, the Growing Impact of Software-Defined Infrastructure, with Christian Perry and Stanley Stevens. I'm Justin Surgent, and I'm hosting today's session. Software-defined IT infrastructure, including software-defined networking and software-defined storage, grows critical to data center revolution in tandem with IT organizations' requirements for efficiency, agility, productivity, and cost-effectiveness. With virtualization pervasive across data centers, emerging trends such as cloud, big data, and open source create challenges for vendors that relied historically on proprietary hardware for the bulk of their revenue. Software-defined infrastructure will be a game changer for enterprises that adopt it and vendors that deliver it. In today's webinar, TVR Principal Analyst Christian Perry and Stanley Stevens will share their perspectives on how data center, cloud, virtualization, SDN, SDS, and hardware commoditization impact software-defined infrastructure. They will then field questions from the audience. If you'd like to learn more about TVR's data center research, please reach out to one of us at the end of the presentation and we can share more information. Before we begin the presentation, however, there are a few housekeeping items I would like to cover. First, we will be recording today's session and posting it on our YouTube site, TVRI channel. We encourage you to visit our channel to watch this presentation or any of the previous we've posted. Second, as previously mentioned, the analysts will accept questions from the audience. Please send them to the Q&A function and we will address them at the end of the presentation. Third, we will send out the slides, as well as a link to the recording to everyone registered for today's webinar within 24 hours of the conclusion of the presentation. Please feel free to view our previous webinars on YouTube and SlideShare as well. I'll send the link to these pages in the chat function. Now let me introduce the analyst presenting today. As Data Center Principal Analyst and Practice Manager.
Today, Stan and I are going to be examining multiple elements of software-defined IT, or what some might call the software-defined data center. First and foremost, the idea of the software-defined data center, and even software-defined IT, really remains a vision, or in some cases what we call a marketecture. With that said, we do believe that next-generation IT infrastructures will require SDN, or software-defined networking, and they will require SDS, or software-defined storage. We do find that IT organizations are facing really a massive set of challenges today when trying to keep up with the business that they're serving. And traditional infrastructure just is increasingly less of an answer to help them keep up with those requirements. A lot of complexity, a lot of management challenges. We'll also look at the impact of software-defined IT and what we expect will happen in the market and what's happening now. That includes the changing role of IT personnel. So let's get started. Stan?
Thanks, Christian. So before we dive deep into it, as Christian mentioned, software-defined really is a vision or architecture. And kind of let's step back and walk through kind of the evolution of the typical data center, starting back with the 90s, and how we got to where we are today, and then take a look at some futuristic things beyond 2015. You know, back in the 90s, I remember client-server architectures, a lot of file sharing, you know, working with some of the early apps like email. It was really just the basics back then. And back then it was very hardware intensive. Hardware really ruled the data center. You were working with components back in the early 90s around network hubs, if you will, even before network switching came about. You were working with LAN and WAN routers and server farms. You know, and then back then it was really around best effort transport. And again, it was more of we're back just at that point, back in our very early stages. As we moved into the 90s and getting closer to the 2000s, that's when things like shared Ethernet came about. That's when we looked at more early adopter applications like early digital media, MPEG, if you will. And really all of that started sparking the need to become more sophisticated. Back then, as the network matured, it became distributed. It put a lot of pressure on components like the servers and server farms, and that really put pressure on storage. Storage back then was really revolving around NAS and DAS implementations and early fiber channel. And if you take a look at it, all of this was managed from a device level. There was some enterprise, but really it was mainly device level type of management. As we moved into the early 2000s, now we're focusing more around desktops migrating to laptops, the introduction of cell phones now into the network, some early stage virtualization. As you took a look at this evolution going from 90s to 2000s, there was already that conversation around the network is becoming very complex, it's becoming very costly, it's taxing resources. Oh, by the way, virtualization can help. Well, as some early adopters will tell you, it did provide some benefits and values, but it also did provide some underlying complexities. It did bring forth some dedication through the transport and quality of service, but it also created some complexities around virtual machine sprawls and storage silos. As more and more companies move towards virtualization from test and dev type of environments to early limited production, that's where they started to not just look at their network growing from a server and storage perspective with a lot of virtual machines and a lot of silos of storage, but also complexity. There were some things from a storage perspective that helped. The introduction of iSCSI certainly helped in bringing in this notion of, hey, we're going to be a little bit less complex than some of the traditional methods. When we move now into the mid-2000s and 2015s, and we're taking a look at, again, evolving technologies, whether it's tablets, smartphones, moving more towards mainstream virtualization and cloud, again, we're still adding more and more complexity onto the network. Compounded with, again, more and more applications coming onto the forefront, whether we're now adopting things like massive digital media and social media and what that's driving from a network perspective. It's bringing forth, and I'll talk about it a little bit later, things like big data and all. It's really requiring more system-level agreements. It's really bringing forth this notion of convergence, if you will, data center consolidation and convergence, and really this unification as well, unification from a storage perspective and bringing forth all the different methods of storage, the silos that were created back in the 2000s, really trying to unify those. The other tricky component to all this is how do you manage all this? How do you manage it from a networking perspective? If your servers are indeed virtualized now, your storage is up there, and it's supporting the virtual machines. How do you manage it from a networking and storage perspective? And really this early adoption of centralized management that brings forth automation, brings forth orchestration, and that ties into trends that we'll talk about in a few minutes around things like cloud computing. When we move beyond 2015, very much TBR sees the trend around Internet of Things really driving, in addition to the trends of cloud, really driving forth this data center evolution. Components like sensors are going to lead to that. Open source cloud is certainly going to impact that. The need for real-time SLAs now, really making sure that, we'll talk about in a minute this autonomy around the business units. It's going to create some challenges around there. You'll look at things like hyperconverged, which I know Christian will touch upon, as well as the adoption of mainstream centralized management. This is where you bring forth sort of you're in the initial stages of deploying things like software-defined networking or software-defined storage or software-defined IT. You bring forth really the mainstream of utilizing all of these capabilities, whether it's open source cloud, whether it's hyperconverged, what have you, to bring forth the value of moving towards a software-defined IT infrastructure. So with that, and now that we walk through the data center evolution, let me hand it back over to Christian, where he's going to talk about how this evolution is really impacting the role of IT.
So when we take a look at what's going to happen to the various roles of IT as a result of the evolution Stan speaks to, and that's the evolution of the data center around software-defined. We begin to see multiple changes, and really as we talk to customers, we know that most of these changes are already underway, but this is really a steady change, and there will be resistance from that old guard of IT that doesn't want to change. But these changing roles are inevitable. And for the vendors, there is opportunity to guide IT along this new path. One change here that will happen is that the strategy of the IT organization will shift from the traditional model, focused on performance, focused on support, focused on availability, to one that focuses on the applications and the data. This includes a focus on where these things should reside. Should they be on-prem? Should they be hosted on cloud, in colo? This change is happening because of the rise of needs from a project or a workload basis. We see this again and again popping up in various areas. Specific applications for specific purposes, specific data for specific purposes. But really, this rule has for it to come to reality or for it to even be realistic, IT needs time freed up. Software-defined can help them get there. We also know that IT organizations that are sort of embracing software-defined will adopt new personas. There'll be internal evangelists, there'll be politicians, there'll be strategists. Instead of that traditional purchase and break-fix sort of persona that they've had for decades. This is really critical to ensure that the rest of the business gets on track with the changing nature of IT. And don't forget that, by the way, budgets are tied really closely to that whole equation. If those rules take hold, then what happens here is these rules help enable internal sales where IT can use as a service to foster a more strategic role and help drive the business. That's what it comes down to. So this is starkly different from a traditional IT ecosystem, the IT ecosystem of old, where the focus was on, and continues to be, on hardware, software, and that's about it. How can IT service the business? That's really the goal here. Once IT is accepted in these new rules, IT will become key members of cross-functional internal teams that essentially align with line of business leaders, those same leaders who focus on enhancing business processes through technology. There's convergence going on here. We first heard, or at least there was a lot of hype being driven around business IT convergence in the early 2000s. Now, 15 years later, now we started to see it actually taking hold. But most of these things won't happen without changes to the technologies themselves, because the technologies must support the rules, and the rules must support the business. That's good news for both IT and also for vendors that support IT, because then customer adoption happens. That's all underway. So we're just now putting the finishing touches on the first deliverable of this year's customer research on hyperconverged. The second deliverable will release in December. This is 200 slides of insight, so there's plenty we're learning here about the changing dynamics in IT, especially around software-defined. So there's a lot of hype around software-defined, but in hyperconverged, which we see as an on-ramp to software-defined storage, and frankly, that's how a lot of customers are looking at it as well. They want to get to software-defined storage. They're not quite sure how to get there because there's not a lot of off-the-shelf options outside of hyperconverged. But hyperconverged, for a particular set of workloads, and that set is expanding every day, that is something that is easily digestible, easily purchasable, and being deployed right now at quite a rate. We project now a $10.6 billion addressable market in the U.S. over the next 12 months for hyperconverged platforms. Software-defined storage is underway. It's underway right here with hyperconverged. So, you know, there's a lot of drivers behind this. We talk about it in the research, but really it comes down to IT needs to better handle business requests. They can't do that if they're dealing with all the complexity that's inherent in storage and networking. but these types of platforms can help them at least get a little bit closer. And we've seen this in recent years with our converged systems research, where more than ever, customers are at least willing to consider adopting what we might call alternate infrastructures, anything other than standalone, for them to get away from that complexity. It's happening in a big way now already with converged, and perhaps even more so with hyper-converged.
So now that we talked about the evolving role of IT, let's dive deeply into one of the two important components around software-defined IT, and that being software-defined storage. Now let's separate the hype from reality, and let's start with the fact that software-defined storage is certainly creating a lot of buzz in the industry today and spurring a lot of debates around whether it's just another marketing buzzword or a true technology driver. Now, we at TBR certainly believe it's a technology driver. It's most likely on a slow roll path. It's really going to be driven by evolving trends like cloud computing, like hyper-converged, as Christian just mentioned, and I know he'll get a little bit deeper into hyper-converged later. One of the challenges for software-defined is really the lack of a well-defined definition. The fact right now is that there is no true definition out there. You know, the Storage Network Industry Association developed a working draft that defines SDS, and they've created a framework that basically identifies some of the key capabilities and features that an SDS platform should have. But really today there's no real standard. The one definition that SNIA has is that it's the abstraction and simplification of network storage. It further goes on to define SDS as a key element within the software-defined data center framework. But again, we'll get into a little bit more in this webinar, and we'll show you how various vendors in the vendor segments have different definitions as to what their software-defined platform is and what it will bring to the marketplace. Now, certainly fueling the marketing buzz around software-defined storage are trends such as cloud computing and big data. And certainly those are areas that continue to drive the demand for storage. And, you know, with that demand for storage comes the challenge around the rising cost and complexity of storage, or the notion that it is costly and complex. And certainly because of that, either IT organizations or even cloud providers are looking for more cost-effective options to manage their infrastructure. So certainly that's going to fuel the continued interest around software-defined storage. You know, another fact that I want to touch upon quickly is that you've got legacy environments out there today that really are disparate, whether we're talking about vendors such as EMC or IBM or HP or Dell. You know, through the 2000s, those companies had acquired other storage companies and brought them into their portfolios. And with that brought in different disparate storage architectures that required different management tools. So my point is that they were driven also to create this single pane of glass that's also part of software-defined storage to manage these legacy environments as well as commodity architectures moving forward. So, you know, certainly that's going to continue to move forward. Those are facts. So the goal is really for SDS to manage heterogeneous multi-vendor management of storage arrays as well as commodity hardware. Are they at that point today? Again, we'll touch upon a little bit in a moment here, but certainly most of the software-defined storage platforms that we're aware of do focus on being able to manage their environments today and then reaching out into some others. There are certainly platforms out there today that from a commodity perspective can manage those environments, but again, this true heterogeneous back and forth, it really isn't there today. From a challenge perspective, as we take a look at this, you know, there's going to be a lot of back-end planning. If we step back a minute and we look at sort of how we got here from an SDS perspective, you know, I liken the introduction and the concept and the adoption initially of software-defined storage around a couple software companies, and that's Microsoft and VMware. And the fact that they kind of introduced this concept when they released, in Microsoft's case, storage spaces through Windows Server 2012 and VMware through VASA. And really, those were initiatives that provided alternative methods for managing storage. And really, as we move forward again, there have been some abilities to go out there and manage heterogeneous environments, but they're not there today. So when you take a look at what is it really required to be able to accomplish this today, it's the challenge of handling the back-end planning and administration that's still required. It's the fact that there's still firmware sitting on these storage devices that handle such things as RAID assignment or LUN creation and things of that nature. So from the perspective of, what's the driver aside from cloud and hyperconverged, if we go back to the rising cost and complexity of storage, there is still going to be some back end, so that's really going to hamper some of the adoption moving forward. And really taking a look at when you invest in this storage management, how long does it take you to really recognize the real value behind it? It's going to take, in some cases, 2 or more years to recognize that value. So these are some of the challenges in really looking at the adoption rate around software-defined storage. Moving on to the next slide, let's talk about and dive into some of the dynamics around what's driving this. And one of them certainly is virtualization, and that's contributed to the requirement for storage and driving really the requirement for increased storage utilization. And I think that also contributed to sort of the increased cost and complexity of storage, as well as the burden on the resources. I remember back in the 2000s, there were a couple of vendors that had the tagline of server virtualization requires storage virtualization. So my point is even back in the 2000s, there were storage vendors that were out there with this notion of being able to abstract sort of some of the underlying storage management complexities and really making it easier to handle some of the underlying storage management capabilities and being able to do that across multiple storage arrays. The challenge, again, is that for the most part, when it was a single platform, that was okay. When it was multiple platforms, that created a problem. And again, as virtualization kind of grew up and required more and more storage, it also required different storage types, which I'll talk about in a minute. But those storage types that I'm referring to are around DAS, NAS, SAN, as well as trying to unify those, as well as bringing in things like object store, which brings me to my next dynamic around big data and analytics. Certainly, those have impacted storage as larger and more complex data sets need to be supported on the data center. Big data, in my opinion, has been driven largely by digital and social media, as well as others, but, really the explosion of digital and social media via mobile devices. Big data in itself requires new means of integration to uncover the valuable information from these larger data sets. Big data, in some cases, what's driving that from a storage perspective really is object store and the ability to support metadata. Certainly there are the other storage alternatives out there today that can handle big data and analytics, but for the most part, when we take a look at big data, it's always referencing object storage as a means to address that. The next dynamic is around cloud computing, and it certainly continues to drive conversations around public, private, and hybrid. A key component, it's no secret, is certainly storage and the debate around storage. And as more and more cloud providers are looking towards commodity storage to handle the explosion of storage growth, again, it's happening in pockets. Again, it's going to be a slow roll. There are some things around some commonality within the storage management framework that are being addressed by things like the open source initiative. So certainly it's going to continue to move forward. And again, as cloud continues to mature, it can become more mainstream. Certainly that's going to continue to drive the conversation around storage management and complexity. The last area around hybrid IT really touches upon the autonomy of the business units and the lines of business, and the fact that these lines of business, because they have autonomy, they're really focused on their strategy, how they accomplish their goals, and what type of services they need from the IT organization, whether it's in-house or whether it's out of house. And really what's spurring a lot of that is the ability to grab these out as service offerings that line of businesses can easily access and easily implement into the IT environment, and really making sure that at that point the IT organization has to be working proactively with these lines of businesses so that they can understand their role moving forward as to how they're going to address this type of dynamic. With these dynamics, virtualization, big data, cloud, and hybrid, now comes some challenges. And certainly one challenge is around storage growth and the fact that it's continuing to grow dramatically. Certainly not going to get into, there's a lot of forecasts around there that talk to the extent of growth, and I'm not going to get into that, but suffice to say, the growth is there, and with the growth comes, again, the demand of adding more and more storage types, and certainly with that comes the second challenge of how do you manage this. And I talked about it previously, so I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but again, think about it. You have many different types of storage out there today. You have many different methods of how you can manage that storage, either in a block, a file, or an object environment. How do you handle those types? How do you handle it across platform? And then, how do you make sure that you're being able to bring all of these in, these capacity and performance tools, so that you can now do the third challenge, which is proactive planning. There's a lot of challenges around proactive planning because, again, IT organizations are in reactionary mode. They're not in proactive mode. So, again, trying to even look at performance matrix and capacity planning in real time is very, very difficult. Last challenge before I turn it back over to Christian is really around the departmental autonomy that I spoke about previously, and the fact that the IT organizations really have to go out there and, as Christian mentioned in the beginning, reinvent themselves to become more internal evangelists, more aligned with the strategy, and more sales folks so that they can proactively help the entire business move forward. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Christian, and he'll talk about deep dive in SDN.
Thanks, Stan. So if there's one thing that's certain, beside death and taxes, about software-defined networking and NFV, it's that the ecosystem is really complex. There are different definitions floating around everywhere. There are different thoughts on use cases, different thoughts on benefits, on challenges, and so on. But let's just get this out of the way. Let's take a quick look at how we, TBR, define these elements. So we define SDN as an architecture that decouples the control plane from the data plane and then further abstracts that control plane from applications and network services. The end result is the ability to have that sort of direct control, that programmability of network switches, as well as the control over the underlying infrastructure as well. NFV we define as a network architecture that virtualizes network device functions. So functions like load balancers, firewalls, WAN accelerators, intrusion detection, and so on. In this case, we see commercial off-the-shelf hardware being integrated with one or more VMs that support different software and different processes as well. Looking at the distribution of these technologies, I don't think it's a secret at this point that SDN is primarily an enterprise play, while NFV is a service provider play, but there is plenty of overlap that we see with each side integrating innovations that are spawned in the other. We think that will continue. There's still a lot of room for growth and movement across protocols, across standards and standards bodies. This is a very young market segment here, younger on the SDN side in the enterprise. NFV is a little farther along, or a lot farther along actually. And there's a lot of opportunity as well. And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about some of the players who are capturing some of that early opportunity in a bit. So if we look at what's driving what there is around SDN right now, so there's a lot of hype I think that the hype is turning into reality at this point, because we're actually seeing the technology baked into switches, for example. But there's a lot of resistance on the customer side as well. This is something that also is going to change rules, but not rules in the way that I discussed earlier around overall IT. It's going to change the role of network administrators and also developers who have to understand how to program for the network. And then the network administrators have to understand how to manage applications. So, you know, there will be resistance. I mentioned that old IT guard. You're going to see that big time here increasingly with SDN. But you know, for the challenges related to the business requirements that are driving almost every organization now, regardless of vertical, the traditional architecture, the network architecture, is showing its age, it's showing its cracks. So if we look out ahead, we think that the early adopter phase of SDN will actually begin in 2016. Yeah, there is some adoption happening now, but these are technologies that we see are ready to be turned on, but aren't being turned on yet. Customers aren't quite ready. They want to, if they're going to upgrade now, they want that future proofing. But, you know, moving into next year, that's where we see, you know, some of the successful trials already being, you know, accomplished, and then the business cases being solidified. And then we look at mainstream adoption. We expect that to happen by 2019, with most enterprises having some form of SDN in their networks. So where is that going to happen? We do feel that, and it's a bit of a no-brainer, that SDN will happen in developed markets first. These are the organizations that, again, are dealing with the cracks showing in the existing network infrastructure. These are the ones that are dealing with emerging workloads that are tied to business value, analytics. Stan talked a lot about these areas that are driving software-defined storage. They're also impacting the network as well. So, you know, what markets are we talking about? Especially the U.S. The majority of early deployments have taken place here, and the majority of SDN vendors are here in the U.S. So we think that this is going to be a hotbed moving forward for SDN development, SDN innovation, and SDN deployment. So there are drivers, and we talked a lot about the overall drivers of software-defined IT and the software-defined data center, if you will. There are a few others, if we're going to get a little bit more specific. You know, that's, you know, the whole question around proprietary hardware, it still comes into play. And I'll talk about that on the next slide when we look at the vendor landscape. But there's just not the same need that there used to be for expensive, proprietary, complex hardware that there used to be on the network side, because it's proven now in certain deployments that software can handle all of the things, you know, that abstracted software can handle all the things that routers and switches used to be able to do when it was baked into them. Also, the purchasing and deployment model, software-based, more streamlined, and, you know, from a cost perspective as well, I think it's a little bit easier for customers to see the value when you factor in the commodity hardware beneath it as well. And then, you know, the technical drivers, you know, we did talk about some of these things, you know, from an overall software-defined angle, better agility, better flexibility, actually increased reliability and uptime. That might be a surprise to some folks who think that, oh, sure, if I'm running white box hardware beneath software, isn't my reliability and uptime going to take a hit? Actually, not necessarily, because the management protocols and the management capabilities that now are being driven on the software side are going to help improve some of those factors. But there are inhibitors as well. One of the big ones here with SDN, and we see it with SDS as well, it's simply lack of awareness. It's lack of understanding. That leads to fear. And there continues to be fear out there in the customer arena around anything software defined. We continue to see it with hyperconverged. We just saw it this year. But although it's not stopping adoption there, if there are products that are easily digested from an education standpoint and an understanding standpoint, adoption will happen. But if it's not real clear, if it's just kind of baked into various products, they won't see the overall vision. That really ties into that clearly defined business case. Customers need to understand that what they're investing in is going to tie back to the business. I talk about those changing roles. IT wants to be strategic, but if they don't understand how the technology is going to benefit the business, then they can't be a strategic partner to the business itself. Complexity. This is a different set of capabilities that IT will have to assume around the management of a different type of ecosystem. That technical role will change as well. We talked to a lot of vendors just this year, saying that the network administrator, the storage administrator might not be around as soon as 2 to 3 years from now. It's going to change. We agree to some extent, but I think they're also being a bit optimistic, thinking that software defined is going to take off extremely quickly. We wouldn't necessarily agree with that. We think it's going to be a bit more gradual in certain segments. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Stan. So we can look at going back to this overall software defined, we can look at some of the threats and opportunities around that.
Thanks, Christian. So quickly, I'm just going to touch upon a couple of things for the threats. So certainly, software defined is going to contribute to faster adoption rate of commodity hardware versus traditional hardware. That, again, is certainly a threat. It's going to be potentially a slow roll depending on. And with that, one of the reasons why it might be a slow roll is the second threat, which is the fact that SDS and SDN will negatively impact revenue from some of the traditional storage vendors. The last 2 points around the architectures, some of the unproven architectures are going to slow down and disrupt deployment cycles and also potentially create false positives. With these challenges come opportunities. Some of these new startups are going to create acquisition targets by the CT and IT vendors. It's going to create new market potentials, close relationships with operators, as well as the ability to continue driving strategic C-level engagements with those decision makers. And then last, really get the focus around higher margin potential via software-led strategy versus hardware-led. So those quickly are the threats and opportunities. Let me cover quickly the landscape, and I'll just point on a couple of things. Number one, I think from a traditional storage vendor, keep in mind they're trying to protect their legacy and continue to try to drive as much revenue as they can. Software defined helps them with that from the standpoint that they can provide this single pane of glass for their disparate platforms. It also allows them to address this shift towards commodity hardware if and when it happens, and again, they have this overall arching end-to-end type of holistic story. From a software side of the house, again, I'll just point out that VMware and Microsoft back in, it was around 2007-8, were driving this. They wanted to drive towards software-defined storage. They are making some inroads. I think, again, around open standards, it's going to help drive that a little bit more. So again, they're out there really marching that commodity hardware type of message because they have no legacy hardware to be cognizant of. Lastly, on the startups, you're looking at SDS startups that really are single focus, kind of looking at either cloud opportunities or hyper-converged infrastructures. So again, they're going to continue to move that and move in that direction. The challenge for them is going to be that because they are singularly focused, they're going to run into the big traditional guys, and the big traditional folks are going to have, other types of storage methods that they can deploy within the software-defined storage discussion, if you will. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Christian again to talk about the SDN landscape before we wrap it up and take Q&A.
Thanks, Dan. And I do want to leave time for questions. I'm not going to spend too much time on these slides. We ran a bit long. But when we take a look at SDN, we're at the vendor landscape here. We're looking at it from two sides. The side with the proprietary hardware and SDN controller vendors, and then the network overlay software vendors. So on the former side, we're looking at Cisco, HP, Juniper, Brocade, Arista. These are, especially in the case of Cisco, this is Cisco that essentially is turning a battleship here with its business model. It talked a lot in its last earnings call about its engagements and in its pipeline as well, and how things are turning towards solutions and transformation, not so much point product. And with its Nexus switches, it is at least through the SDN technology that's baked in. It is helping customers to sort of understand the transformation that they can enable if they are to flip on that switch of SDN within their ecosystems. But we don't expect that everybody will survive the shift over time to software-defined. These vendors here, we think, are on the right path. They're doing the right things to stay, to keep their feet in both camps, both software-defined and traditional network hardware. We do think, just like on the storage side, that there will be use cases for traditional infrastructure. Moving forward, but they will likely be more workload specific, perhaps around mission critical, whether mission critical workloads or mission critical environments, until that day that software defined is fully proven. But we're a long way off. Again, I talked about that customer fear. That is going to continue. On the other side, we have these network overlay software vendors. In this camp, we do start to see the emergence of pure plays and startups. We see that in software-defined storage as well. So then you see, along with the traditional software vendors like Microsoft, Oracle, VMware, we see a Cumulus, we see a Big Switch. These vendors are providing solutions that are, as you see here, hardware agnostic. So this is where we start to see the emergence of white box beneath that software layer. Whereas up above, we see things like bright box that is not quite white box because it has some IP baked in from the particular vendors, and that provides differentiation, of course. So there's two sides here moving forward. There could be consolidation between the two camps as well, as we expect to see in any growing market. But for the time being, there's a lot of opportunity out there. And there's opportunities across both sides of these vendor camps. It will depend on the customer and where the customer wants to go with SDN in terms of how fast this market will evolve. So wrapping up before we get to Q&A. Again, software-defined data center, software-defined IT, it's still primarily a vision. Outside of the service provider market, where it is actually, it's becoming reality pretty quickly. But in the enterprise, it's still tied closely to marketing efforts and messaging around transformation. That's not a bad thing. Because customers do want to transform. They want to get away from those traditional architectures which are driving in so much complexity that they can't be of value to the business. And the business wants IT to be that strategic partner. So SDS, SDN, server virtualization is established. These are the emerging areas that we see in the enterprise, and these will continue to evolve. And in some cases, again, with hyperconverged, they're evolving pretty quickly, and adoption is happening fast. And again, the rules of IT are going to change. I won't get too much into that. I talked a lot about it. But, bottom line, this is going to be a game changer moving forward, not only for enterprises that take the plunge. And we don't actually think they're going to take the plunge to any great extent, but rather, again, on a project or a workload or a departmental basis first in many cases, and then expand from there. The vendors as well certainly are going to benefit from this evolution. So with that, we'd like to open up the platform to questions. Justin, do you want me to just jump right in?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So first question, how has the $10.6 billion U.S. market projection, that's for hyperconverged, how has that been calculated? This will be about a quarter of the size of the overall server market. Yeah, we actually have a lot through our hyperconverged research. We know the budget plans of customers that we surveyed, and when we compare that against the U.S. Census data and a few other sources that we have about the number of businesses, target businesses for hyperconverged, that's how we develop that addressable market over the next 12 months. Next question, what ROI payback period is expected for software-defined storage implementations? I will say that from the customers that we spoke to, a lot of customers, and we continue to speak to, a lot of customers expect payback within 1 year. There are those who are a little more aggressive and expect payback within 6 months, and there are those who are more conservative that look, beyond a year, out to a year and a half, for example. But the sweet spot is right around a year. Next question, what additional cybersecurity concerns are there with hyperconverged solutions? That's interesting that you should ask that, because with our hyperconverged research, we conducted hundreds of surveys, and we do that throughout the year, so this is a stream of research. And we also conducted a whole bunch of in-depth interviews of customers, and so we asked them a lot of these questions. One thing that kept coming up, and this surprised us, is that when we asked about the benefits of hyperconverged, they keep pointing to security. They're able to actually implement security far more effectively than they were with standalone hardware. So now what's happening is that customers in certain verticals, financial, very competitive manufacturing industries are adopting hyperconverged. Once these use cases get out, and once they're messaged out to the general market, look out, because there are not actually there are not challenges around security that we can see based on the customers that we talk to with hyperconverged. Yes, I'm sure there may be some technical issues here and there, but customers are actually adopting to overcome security challenges.
Another question here, I like this one. How is it that traditional SAN isn't SDS? And how is it that a LUN presented from a SAN isn't a software-defined disk? Well, keep in mind, I mentioned in the beginning that, back in the 2000s, there were vendors out there talking about virtualized storage and the fact that they were extracting some of their storage management capabilities. I think, again, it goes back to there is no true definition. So, I guess one thing I could say to you is there's vendors out there that have the ability to take a single pane of management and manage it across multiple platforms, not just one, but multiple across their portfolio. So it gives them that capability to expand out. As far as the question around LUN, I would suggest that a LUN or a volume can actually extend beyond a disk to a group of disks, so therefore, you're right, you're virtualizing on a series of one or more disks. So it goes back to the earlier point I was making around the definition. and the fact that I think the real challenge that customers are facing with storage complexity, cost is part of it, the other part really is management. And if you have multiple different platforms from vendor X that you bought from vendor X, and you need, multiple different management tools to manage those, okay, and you have to keep opening and closing windows in order to do that, that's very complex. Whereas this notion of single pane of glass that can go across different platforms is really, I believe, what customers are looking for. And that's certainly what customers have communicated to us. The other question around understanding that IT support skill sets will evolve, how many IT support staff positions will be eliminated with SDN implementations, and is the IT services market expected to shrink as a result of SDS-FDN? Well, again, I think, and I'll let Christian kind of chime in, but I think based on customers we've talked to, they've had forward thinking, so they've been able to sit down with their staff and help them with career planning and forward looking to say, hey, you may need to evolve because we're evolving, and they provided them with some career guidance and some training. And so it's not that their positions have been eliminated, they've been able to redeploy them in other positions to make that organization more successful and to make the business more successful. As far as the services market, this is where I think it's not going to shrink because you need a lot of back-end planning, a lot of back-end support to make SDN and SDS work. You're going to see companies out there, managed service companies are already out there that are offering these types of services because they realize that if a company tries to do this on their own, it's going to be very taxing and time-consuming. There's a marketing message, and then there's the actual implementation deployment message. The vendors are out there with a great marketing message around SDS, but I got to be honest with you, based on our research, the back end and really being able to size this, implement it, maintain it, it's right now very, very complex. So
yeah, so keep an eye out in the next week for the press release we're going to put out around our hyperconverged research, because what's happening is that in the case of hyperconverged, and to Stan's point, we expect in the broader software-defined market, customers are going to lean very heavily on their core vendors and on other service providers to provide those strategy, those implementations, those deployment services to help them, get started with some of these types of technologies. There are two questions here that are very similar, so I am going to read both. The first one was, you spoke about networking and storage. How about compute? The other one was, this is a very siloed view of the SDI landscape. One of the end goal benefits of SDI will be an orchestration layer that enables the entire DC to be defined via software rather than the individual pillars of SDN, SDS, SDC, software-defined compute. What is your opinion on this? We absolutely agree that that's one of the end goal benefits, and Stan has talked about single pane of glass management across all these different elements. In the beginning, we talked about the vision. That is indeed the vision, and that's the vision that we believe customers want to achieve. Well, they might achieve the actual vision, but in terms of the actual reality, they want to achieve the reality. And yes, the other pieces are all a part of it. But when we're talking about growth, software-defined, we think that this is the software-defined opportunity is going to occur in chunks. It's going to occur not across an entire enterprise. You can talk to it, but in terms of actual deployment, I don't see how that's actually going to happen unless you're talking about a small business, and we don't see small businesses looking to go fully software-defined. However, they are, small business, perfect example, they are adopting hyperconverged. And it's starting to go upstream as well. So yes, when you're talking about the overall vision, all of those pieces are in there, and the management across all of them, that's certainly all a piece of it. Next question, did you say that adoption is currently faster in the service provider community versus the enterprise? I said that for NFV. And indeed, NFV is, I mean, NFV is built. It's built for service provider environments. This is something, and this is sort of an evolution of the type of network architecture that was, you know, that's been historically in service provider and data center environments. SDN, there are elements of SDN in service provider, but it's primarily NFV. SDN, we see more of an enterprise play, and if you compare the adoption of both SDN in the enterprise and NFV in the service provider market, NFV it far eclipses SDN.
And I think for SDS, what I said earlier was that your early adopters are going to be your very large enterprise environments as well as providers. Specifically, cloud providers have already adopted SDS, not widestream, but there are providers that are adopting SDS right now. And again, I'm going to say that with the caveat that it depends on your definition of SDS as to what they're really adopting.
Next question, SDN and virtualization seems opposite to hyperconverged. How do they relate, interwork, coexist, et cetera? Actually, we would disagree. Virtualization to us is a core element of hyperconverged. When we look at our definition of hyperconverged, you know, from a basic level, it's you know, those platforms that allow a storage controller and an array to exist on the same server. But something else that we expect to see in these platforms is the unification of enterprise storage in virtual machines. This is something that's core to that whole market and core to what customers expect when they shift over to hyperconverged, because they're deploying hyperconverged along with a host of other reasons to improve their storage efficiency. There was there is a similar question. I saw it here somewhere. Yes. Can you elaborate a bit on your description of hyperconverged as an on-ramp to software-defined storage? That seems to imply that customers are buying hyperconverged as a temporary fix. Hyperconverged, to me, seems like a relatively stable solution for certain segments. I absolutely agree with you. Let me clarify what I meant by that. We know, based on our conversations with almost all of the major hyperconverged vendors, both software and appliance vendors, that some of them are targeting environments where customers are not yet virtualized. And I'm not talking fully virtualized, say it's 60%, but I'm talking actual, you know, virtualized at all. These are small businesses. So for those, yes, it is an on-ramp to SDS. But, yeah, this is quickly moving into maturity. We expected maturity to happen in this market early 2017 in terms of the technology and the adoption. We keep pulling that back into 2016 because this is a market that's accelerating with rather impressive speed. Justin, I know I went over the hour here, and thank you all on the phone. This has been a great conversation. We're happy to continue the conversation, and I want to respect your time, so I'll turn it back over to Justin.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you, Christian, and thank you, Stan, and thank you, everyone, for your questions today. You can follow TBR as well as the analysts who presented today on Twitter on their handles listed here. Please check out our pages on SlideShare and YouTube as well, or check out our previous webinars. And one final thing, before you sign off, I'd like to ask you to take a quick survey about today's webinar. Your feedback is greatly appreciated as we look at that to improve the information we provide and how we provide it. We'll leave the chat function open for another minute or two to give folks a chance to ask any last-minute questions. Otherwise, thank you for joining and have a great afternoon.